It's been 54 years of Assads, and they've suffocated Syrians. Bashar al-Assad wanted to be also the leading business person, and he started to create these front companies that were preying on the public sector, taking money from previous cronies. Their distribution of income in the country, like the disparity became broader and broader because of mind-numbing corruption.
Syria's ruling family of the past 50 years is out. So who's going to rebuild this country, and can they improve the lives of normal Syrians? Karam Shaar is director of the Karam Shaar Advisory, based in New Zealand. He joins me now for more. Karam, welcome to the show. You were part of the Syrian uprising in 2011, and then you later left the country. Give us an idea of what the past few days have been like for you.
I've never experienced such a rush of strong but mixed emotions. I think initially I was like millions of Syrians. I would argue the vast majority of Syrians. I was elated. I was over the moon. It's been 54 years of Assads, and they've suffocated Syrians. They've not allowed dissent in any shape or form. They've not, I mean, we had a saying in Syria which translates to walls have ears. So that's the level of fear that people had. And when we decided to take to the streets and protest against this government in the hope of being just like in Tunisia and in Egypt, which had gone through their own uprisings, which lasted for less than a month, and saw their presidents out of office, we thought that's going to be the same for Syria. But then what happened was just outright brutal violence against everyone, chemical weapons, barrel bombs, systemic torture. I'm so glad they're gone. But the reason I'm saying mixed emotions is that happiness is starting to subside, and I'm just a little bit concerned about what's coming next.
And that's what we want to talk about, what's coming next. When can this country start talking about reconstruction?
I think many have already started thinking about this. I can tell you some multilateral institutions and governments are already starting to think about this. However, there are multiple impediments to that. You have the multitude of layers of sanctions which have been imposed on Syria as a country, as well as the Syrian regime, which is now gone. So those sanctions actually started from the 1970s, and then you had when Syria was designated as a state sponsor of terrorism. Again, in 2000s, Syria was also sanctioned because of its role in stabilizing Lebanon and also facilitating the flow of terrorist fighters into neighboring Iraq. But what happened after 2011 was just an explosion in unilateral sanctions. Now, the other impediment is the sanctions that are actually on terrorist organizations. So the strongest faction in control of the country at the moment is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which continues to be designated as a terrorist organization under al-Qaeda sanctions. And lifting that is also not a straightforward process. So there's a lot of planning and thinking that needs to be done before any talk about reconstruction starts to be serious.
Before sanctions come into play, what about running the basic functions of this economy? How hard will it be for any transitional government to, for example, keep basic services going, make sure that civil servants continue being paid?
Actually, for regime-held Syria, the part that is now controlled by the opposition, most people would argue that it couldn't have been worse. So people actually, before the rebels took control of those areas, people were getting a couple of hours of electricity per day. A public sector employee is paid around $20 per month. So I think the situation will improve, and will improve rather quickly, because just providing fuels to power plants would increase the number of hours of electricity that civilians will receive. The new interim government has already announced an increase of 300% in salaries for public sector employees. So I think things will start to improve slowly but steadily.
I think for many of us who may not be so familiar with Syria, we think perhaps oil production as a key of the economy. We look in the past, and Syria was a net exporter of oil for so long. In recent years, it's clearly been an importer. What happened there, and what does it mean for the future of the country?
Compared to countries in the Gulf, for instance, Syria's output, or actually even in neighboring Iraq, Syria's oil output is quite limited. However, relative to the size of the state, it actually played a pivotal role in state finances. In fact, before 2011, nearly a quarter to one-third of state revenue, more importantly in hard currency, used to come from oil. What happened after 2011 was multi-layered. So initially, there were sanctions imposed mainly by the EU, which meant that Syria couldn't export its oil. However, that negative impact on state finances was very, very short-lived, because later on, these oil fields got out of control for the government as they were controlled by other groups. And then actually the control over these oil resources was kind of split between Kurdish factions in northeast Syria, but also more in central Syria, controlled by ISIS. And the international coalition against ISIS, when they intervened, many of those oil wells and facilities were decimated. So the level of output, which used to be around 400,000 barrels per day in 2011, I think at the moment is around 100,000, and maybe 80% of that is in Syrian Democratic Forces areas, which are backed by the US in the northeast, not in the areas that are controlled at the moment by the rebels and before them the Syrian regime.
Does that essentially mean that oil is out of the picture when we talk about the future economy of this country, or the regime, the former regime-controlled area of the country? How significant will that be when at one time it made up, what'd you say, a quarter to a third of the budget?
I mean, what I would expect is many of the international companies to start to talk about going back to their oil blocks in Syria. And in fact, the part that is in the control, under the control of the current government should be able to produce nearly half of what was produced in 2011 if it's fully recovered and fully operational. And however, it takes a lot of time for that to happen. And there's a degree of uncertainty, because at times some of the bombing for those oil fields can actually change the layers of oil, and it might at times just go between the layers and it's no longer recoverable. But we won't know until there is more exploration. However, for the oil fields that are under the control of the Syrian Democratic Forces in the northeast, actually, if they agree to come to the negotiating table, and they've so far been very open to that, then we would actually talk about the Syrian government, a central government, being in control of all of those resources. Once again, a much lower level, but a good starting point.
So it's fair to say that whether we're talking about sanctions or oil production, international engagement is going to be key to the future of this economy and resolving probably these carved out areas that have existed over the past decade plus.
That's exactly right. And not only that, but I would also argue that an initial push from the international community would also be necessary for kickstarting the economy. There is a need for an initial injection of money that would lubricate this machine that has not been working at maximum capacity for over a decade. That would be necessary. However, I just don't see that happening unless there are changes politically and with respect to sanctions.
I want to wrap up by asking you about the Assad regime itself. Give us an idea of the level of plundering of this economy that this regime over 54 years committed upon this country.
It has gone through multiple stages. So the approach of al-Assad, which ruled the country for the first 30 years, was different from what his son Bashar has done in the subsequent 24 years. So al-Assad used to believe in strong institutions. Yes, there was corruption, of course, and his brother-in-law, for instance, Mohammed Makhlouf, definitely benefited from the oil sector. But what happened later when Bashar al-Assad took office, you saw that emergence of crony capitalism, which meant let's let the private sector thrive. And it did actually thrive, but it didn't translate to higher tax take. So the distribution of income in the country, like the disparity became broader and broader because of mind-numbing corruption. So the richest man in the country was the cousin of Bashar al-Assad, Rami Makhlouf. And all of that was actually like up until 2011. Rami Makhlouf was one of the main reasons why people revolted to begin with. But actually, after the uprising, we've also gone through different stages of looting. So up until 2019, that crony capitalism became more coercive. So the Syrian regime started to tell its cronies, look, let's face it, you collected this wealth because we allowed you to collect it, not because you're smart business people, so you have to pay your share to fund the Syrian army. That didn't work for so long. Actually, the cousin of Bashar al-Assad and Bashar himself had a fallout, and he said, like, I can't fund you anymore. But what happened from that period onwards, after 2019, which is the sanctions, the sanctions became much more stringent. The banking sector in neighboring Lebanon had a meltdown, and like a few other factors such as the COVID-19 pandemic, state finances took a strong hit. And this is when the regime started to take another approach, which is the emergence of front businesses. So Bashar al-Assad was no longer content with being the head of state politically, the head of the army. He wanted to be also the leading business person. And he started to create these front companies that were preying on the public sector, taking money from previous cronies and so on and so forth. And if you allow me to just conclude with this, basically what happened is, as the regime was being stringent politically, which prevented economic recovery, in order for it to continue to be able to have that political intransigence, it needed to have sufficient resources. So their argument has been the size of the economic pie is shrinking more and more and more. The only way for us to sustain ourselves is to demand a greater share from it.
You didn't touch on it. I thought you might, and I want to ask you now, what was the role of this regime when it comes to the drug trade? Many people who are viewing this may not be aware of how involved this family was in a growing drug trade across the Mideast.
At the New Lines Institute, we've actually done a lot of work on this with my colleague Caroline Rose. Over the past 3 years, we've consistently been arguing that the Assad regime is the sponsor of the industry. And we never had actual evidence to present, but we could see that seizures on average were between 300 and 400 million pills per year in the region. And we would see a lot of shreds of evidence that this is actually coming from regime-held Syria. You had the cousin of Bashar al-Assad, Samir Kamal al-Assad, sanctioned for his role in Captagon. You had his brother Maher al-Assad sponsoring that industry. However, as actually the recent military operation took control of regime-held areas, all the evidence started to appear, and it's shocking. You're seeing industrial scale production. You're seeing huge facilities that were producing Captagon, and its economic role is difficult to understate. I mean, the amount that accrues to people involved in the industry in Syria, we believe is actually over 1 billion. It's $1 to $2 billion. That is actually at its upper bound. It's actually as large as the state budget combined. You know, all government revenues. In fact, it's almost twice as large as illicit exports combined, all exports.
All right, that's Karam Shaar. We appreciate it, Karam. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.